ओके गाइस, तो आज हम देखेंगे गैस्ट्रोइंटेस्टाइनल सिक्रीशंस, जिसमें सबसे पहली सिक्रीशन होती है सैलिवरी सिक्रीशन। ये पहली सिक्रीशन है जब हम फूड इंजेस्ट करते हैं, तो जो पहली सिक्रीशन एनकाउंटर होती है दैट इज़ सलाइवा। दिस सलाइवा is produced by 3 salivary glands. Number 1, parotid gland. Number 2, submandibular gland, and the last one is sublingual gland. These 3 glands produce saliva that drain into our oral cavity. They produce saliva that drain into our oral cavity. Now, in the oral cavity, saliva has many constituents that serve to initiate digestion in the oral cavity. Now, in the oral cavity, the digestion that is initiated is of starch, a carbohydrate that is mediated by a component amylase in our saliva. Now, because of this amylase, we are able to initiate the digestion of starch in our oral cavity. Now, 2 other components in our saliva, that is immunoglobulin A and lysozyme. Now, what is the function of these 2 components in our saliva? They actually protect our oral cavity against bacteria. So in this way they are antibacterial. They does not allow the bacteria to have its negative effects in our oral cavity, or the bacteria cannot go along with the bolus to our GIT further. One other component of saliva is mucins. These mucins react with water. Ultimately, they produce mucus, and this mucus lubricates the bolus. Bolus is actually a rounded mass of food that is formed after the process of chewing, and it is round, lubricated by the mucus, so that it can pass easily through our esophagus to enter the stomach. Now, the secretions of these 3 glands, are different because they are proteinaceous and mucinaceous. These 2 components differ in their relative proportion because these glands have a different number of serous and mucus cells. These 2 cells, in which serous cells produce proteinaceous components and mucus cells produce mucinaceous components. These 2 acinar cells in these 3 glands differ in their quantity, and that is why their secretions differ in proteinaceous and mucinaceous components. Now when the saliva is being produced by these glands, the blood vessels near them dilate. When we produce saliva, here, this is the production of saliva. Here blood vessels dilate. Why these blood vessels dilate? Because as the saliva passes through salivary ducts, now while it is flowing through the salivary ducts, sodium, now this saliva is passing through ducts here. Here it is flowing through ducts, and after flowing through the duct it will enter the oral cavity. Now while it is in the duct, flowing through the duct, sodium ions and chloride ions, they are absorbed from it. Saliva loses sodium and chloride ions while it is passing through the salivary ducts, whereas potassium and bicarbonate ions are added. While the saliva is passing through the salivary duct, sodium and chloride ions are absorbed, whereas potassium and bicarbonate ions are added to the saliva. Now we can assume that how the saliva passing through the salivary duct is losing something and adding something. Now we will think that NaCl, sodium ion and chloride ion, they are being absorbed, so they will take the water with them. But it is not true. It is not true, because the salivary ducts are impermeable to water. So H2O is not absorbed while the saliva is passing through the salivary ducts. Water is not absorbed, so sodium and chloride ions are being absorbed, but the saliva is not becoming hypertonic. It is hypotonic because water is not being absorbed along with this sodium and chloride. Now, as the rate of secretion increases, there is less time for NaCl to be extracted. Now, if we increase the time here, if we decrease the time here, the saliva is having less time to pass through this salivary duct because we have to produce more and more saliva. So if the saliva secretion increases, here the time of saliva in salivary duct decreases, and so the absorption of NaCl from the saliva in the salivary duct decreases. In this case, the tonicity of saliva rises. In this case, there is hypertonic saliva. But in respect to the plasma, it is always hypotonic. It is not as hypertonic as plasma. Now, what is the daily secretion of saliva? That is approximately 1000 to 1500 milliliter per day. That is an approx value. Now the question comes that how can we control the salivary secretion? There should be a regulating mechanism for this salivary secretion. Now it is almost entirely controlled by the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system. But if sympathetic nervous system comes into play, what will be the effect on saliva? It will increase, the sympathetic stimulus will increase its proteinaceous content. It will increase its proteinaceous content, but it will have no effect on the volume of saliva. No effect on the volume of saliva. Now these are the controlling mechanisms, but yet we are not familiar with the triggering mechanisms. What are the mechanisms that trigger saliva secretion? Now, if we look closely, the saliva secretion is actually initiated before we are having any meal. The salivary secretion is actually initiated before meal, by thinking about or seeing or smelling the food. But after we are having the meal, now initiated mechanisms we have seen, but now after meal, what are the triggering mechanisms that trigger? Here the saliva secretion was initiated, but after meal we have to produce more and more saliva. So what are the triggering factors? After meal, the triggering factor is chewing. When we chew our food, more and more saliva secretion is triggered, and that is purely a physical act. That is a physical act. That was actually a neurological act. We can also condition saliva secretion. Saliva secretion can also be conditioned. Now, how can we condition? For example, if the dogs are conditioned to salivate in response to a ringing bell, by associating this stimulus with a meal. If we present a meal to the dogs and at the same time we ring a bell, after some time, if you do not present them with a meal but only with a ringing bell, the dogs will salivate. And this is how the saliva secretion is conditioned. Two other factors that saliva secretion is prompted by nausea. The saliva secretion is prompted by nausea, but it can be inhibited. It can be inhibited by two factors. The saliva secretion is inhibited in fear and sleep. While we are feared of something or we are sleeping. Now let me enlist the functions of saliva. Why God has produced saliva in our mouth. Now here I am listing the functions of saliva. Now the functions of saliva will include number first, it facilitates swallowing, as we discussed earlier, because it was lubricating the bolus. It keeps our mouth moist. And what is the importance of keeping our mouth moist? So that This moisture can serve as a solvent for the molecules that stimulate the taste buds. Molecules stimulating. These molecules stimulating taste buds require a solvent. So this moisture will act as a solvent for these molecules so that they can stimulate the taste buds. Third function of the saliva is it facilitates the movement of our tongue and lips. So in turn it is facilitating our speech. The other function of the saliva is it keeps our mouth clean. Saliva, as we discussed earlier, also has some antibacterial function. And because the saliva is having antibacterial function, if we see the patients with deficient saliva secretion, these patients, because of this function of the saliva, these patients will be having more susceptibility to dental caries. And the last function we are going to discuss, that is of saliva, is its buffer function. The buffer function of saliva keeps the pH of oral cavity. Because it is a buffer, it will not allow any acidic environment or a basic environment in the oral cavity. It will maintain the pH of the oral cavity at 7. Now this is all about the salivary secretion. Now we will discuss about the gastric secretion.